a comment about.
So I just want to start us off and also say thank you for inviting us, and thank you, Charu, for organizing this, and for helping us to kind of see our stories through the lens of Red May, right? And what can we learn from having this conversation? And I really want to thank you all for being here on a sunny Sunday, where there's so many other maybe better things that you could be doing. But so we want to, we're going to talk about Palestine and Puerto Rico, and we want to hold them together, but we also want to hold them separately. And I think that even by putting them in a title together, putting them in the same room together, there is a lot that resonates across our two stories and realities. But we also just want to take this opportunity to talk about Palestine and to talk about Puerto Rico. And we specifically want to think about the people of these places. And sometimes, both of these countries, these ideas are so overdetermined. You hear them in the news, and they already have so much that people are thinking about. And so we want to kind of try to bring the focus to what does this actually mean for people. And oftentimes they're these placeholders for larger ideas, and they can serve and justify larger rhetorics that are often anti-colonial or anti-capitalist. But we want to think of them in those ways. And we also want to think about them specifically for the people that are from these places and that live there. I also, in a panel about settler colonialism, I want to acknowledge that we are on Coast Salish lands, and that we are visitors and settlers here. And we're going to start with, Maryam is going to share with us about Palestine, and then Jose, who is from Puerto Rico, spent time in the Middle East, is also going to then kind of make some connections, and then I'm going to end up talking a little bit about the two twin hurricanes, the Det and Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico at the end. Okay, so that's the plan. And then you all questions and everything. Can I just get a quick sense of where you all are, how you all are coming to this? How many of you are university students? Mm-hmm. Okay. Mm-hmm. All right. How many of you feel like you have a pretty good idea about what's going on in Palestine? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. How many of you feel like you have a pretty good idea about what's going on in Puerto Rico? Mm-hmm. Okay. And those of you who are not university students? Okay. Where do the rest of you come? The faculty. The faculty. Who else? Those who are not university students. Where? Yeah.
Like why am I here?
Yeah. Like what brings you here? Yeah.
Oh,
okay. Cool. Yeah. Anyone else want to share? Yeah.
I'm involved in local politics. I try to know how all of this fits together. How does the head tax, Amazon, all the local politics, how does it fit into the big picture of what's happening in Palestine?
Okay. Good. Thank you. Yeah. Yes.
I'm a retiree with the finding out a volunteer for Red May.
Okay. All right. Awesome. Good. Thank you for sharing. That'll help us, because that'll help us sort of, shape our talk and our comments today. So, yes, did you want to say? All right. Mm-hmm. Welcome. Okay. All right, shall we? Let's take it away, Maryam.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So first of all, thank you very much to Philip for that introduction and for making space at Red May for this panel. Thank you so much to Charu for suggesting this pairing. I really appreciate it. And then, of course, thank you so much to my co-panelists. It is truly my honor to be sitting next to them presenting today. I am going to give a sort of disorganized talk. I hope that you will forgive me. It is a little bit of a challenge for an academic to speak to an audience like this that's very mixed, and it's a challenge that I don't have a lot of experience with. So I was trying to think, who am I talking to here? Am I talking to people who know the situation in Palestine very well? Am I talking to scholars who share certain kinds of languages that I've been trained in? Am I talking to community members who don't know that much about Palestine but are trying to learn? Am I talking to my students? Turns out half of you are my students. Extra credit for everyone. But in any case, that's true. That's real. You guys get extra credit. But in any case, I have come up. I was thinking of a provocation for how to develop this talk, and I thought, after the most recent events in Gaza, I listened to, on my commute, a lot of NPR coverage of the situation, and I thought, what is it that I wish that I could say to NPR, right? So that's kind of like a medium ground where, we're going to do a little bit of the coverage of the basics because they don't even get the basics sometimes. And then also, I hope there will be something in here for people who know a lot more than just the basics. So did we say the name of this panel?
Oh, yeah, no, we didn't.
No, okay. So the name of the panel is Palestine and Puerto Rico, Colonialism's Unnatural Disasters. And so in both contexts, we're looking at how colonialism has created a situation in which disasters, both natural and unnatural, become much more severe and create a bigger crises than maybe they would need to be. And so, there's a lot to talk about in the context of Palestine. My research really focuses more on the West Bank and the specific context there. But because of the most recent incidents, I thought, I'm going to talk about Gaza today. I'm going to take my time and to talk a little bit about Gaza and then connect it to Israel's broader settler colonial project. So on May 14th, just a couple of weeks ago, we heard significant news media coverage of events in Gaza. And in particular, what happened on May 14th was that Israel engaged in extreme violence against peaceful Palestinian protesters in the Gaza Strip who were engaged in a 6-week-long event, nonviolent protest called the Great March of Return. Now, that Great March of Return started on March 30th, and it ended on May 15th, so 6 weeks. The idea of the Great March of Return was for Palestinians in Gaza, as elsewhere, to assert their internationally recognized right of return. Oh, is this happening? No. Sorry, there it is. Thank you for looking back and realizing that I haven't done this. Yeah. So the idea of the Great March of Return was for Palestinians to assert their right of return. And this was an event that got a lot of media attention this year, but it's actually been happening for the last 20 years, every year. It doesn't happen for 6 weeks. It usually happens around the May 14th, May 15th date. And it happens in moving locations across historic Palestine. So they choose a village, and then they have this Great March of Return, a kind of nonviolent protest, just to remind the international community and remind one another that they hold this guaranteed right of return from being exiled from their homeland. And so what happened on May 14th of this year is that in response to this 6 weeks of protest, Israel massacred 62 Palestinians and wounded almost 3,000 in just 24 hours, in a 24-hour period. Now, across the whole 6 weeks, from March 30th through May 15th, Israel killed 113 Palestinian protesters and wounded 12,000. And when I say wounded, I'm not talking about scratches. I'm talking about people who managed to survive being shot with bullets that explode when they're inside your body. So, these are not images that I care to circulate, but you can find the images of people with exit wounds from being shot with one bullet that are the size of a fist. Now, that massacre that Israel carried out on the nonviolent protesters in Gaza coincided with the opening of the U.S. Embassy in Israel, which was a symbolic move that Donald Trump sanctioned or whatever, ordered to suggest that the U.S. is now, again, in contravention of international law, recognizing Jerusalem as Israel's capital rather than as a binational Israeli and Palestinian capital, which it is supposed to be under international law. A lot of news media coverage talked about this protest that was happening on May 14th as a protest against the opening of the U.S. Embassy, but that is just sort of, it's like an intentional removal of the event from its context. I don't know what to tell you. Like 6 weeks of protest, and then all of a sudden it's in reaction to the U.S.'s embassy, instead of thinking about it differently, which is that the U.S. Embassy may have been planned in reaction to these protests. Number one. Number two, It also coincided on May 14th with the day that Israel celebrates its Independence Day, also known as the day that Israel was established, the State of Israel was established. May 15th, the next day, is the day that Palestinians recognize as Nakba Day, or the Day of the Catastrophe, which is basically the forced exile of, and the turning, I'm not doing English right, the forced exile of 750,000 Palestinians, which was approximately 3/4 of the existing indigenous Palestinian population in historic Palestine, turning them into refugees. Now, the displacement of these 75% of Palestinians is connected to the march because, again, the march was asserting Palestinians' right of return. That right of return originates in that moment of displacement. So those 750,000 Palestinians, 3/4 of the population at the time, plus all of their descendants all around the world, enjoy this internationally recognized right of return to historic Palestine. Not to their home, not to their one house, but to the whole homeland of Palestine. So this is, again, very much connected. The ending of the march on this day, on the Nakba Day, is connected to that history. I also think that it's quite significant that this year the Great March of Return was held in Gaza because the Strip, 70% of the Gaza Strip population is refugees, people who are descendants of people who were displaced in 1948 with the establishment of the State of Israel. So that's a little bit of the context of why I have chosen, my Fitbit is telling me that I'm getting my steps. I'm not getting my steps, I'm just talking with my hands. That's a risk. Yes. So this is why I've chosen to talk about Gaza, even though my specialty is more the West Bank, because this is really something that is happening now and that is tied to the history and the future of all of Palestine. Now, sometimes you will have heard some media talking about the Nakba, talking about the anniversary of the State of Israel, etc., when they talked about this Great March of Return. What you will not have heard, I would love to see a hand if you did hear this, is that the march started on March 30th, which is Palestinian Land Day, an equally important holiday or commemoration. So Land Day, March 30th, and here I've just provided some of the many, many beautiful political posters that get issued in commemoration of Land Day every year. If you Google it, you will see an amazing collection of images of such posters. Palestinian Land Day is a remembrance of the 1976 murders by Israel of 6 Palestinian citizens of Israel who were peacefully protesting Israel's seizure of Palestinian land in the Galilee. So this is inside of Israel. Israel took Arab or Palestinian villages, took their land. There were nonviolent protesters, and Israel killed 6 of them. And so this sparked a lot of resistance inside Israel among Palestinians, outside Israel among Palestinians. And so Land Day both commemorates those murders and also commemorates Palestinian resistance against the theft of land. We should not lose sight of the fact that Land Day is called Land Day, which always reminds us that the project of Israeli settler colonialism is about territory and about annexing territory. And so I'm going to come back to that point in a minute. So if you did hear media coverage of any part of the Great March of Return, what you will have heard is an extreme hand-wringing around the question of whether it was Israel or the Palestinians themselves who were responsible for the murders of these Palestinians. And I am sorry to say that I had the displeasure of hearing the former Israeli ambassador to the U.S., Michael Oren, say on the radio more than once that Israel had no other choice but to murder these peaceful Palestinian protesters, that the Palestinian protesters were throwing themselves in the way of the bullets. I'm sorry, it's just I'm not smiling at it, it's just sort of okay. And actually a quote from him there actually is no other effective method we know of defending the border. And the choice is, is paying a price in terms of, tough interviews like this one, or letting these terrorists come through the border and kill our civilians. And for us, that's a no-brainer. That's Michael Oren, ladies and gentlemen. By the way, just as a reminder, since I have the microphone, Michael Oren was the target of the Irvine 11 protests several years ago. These were students from UC Irvine and UC Riverside who protested to shut down a propaganda event that Michael Oren was doing, and then paid many prices for it, including actually being convicted in court of a variety of ridiculous charges. So they are heroes, and his continuing propaganda just further proves their heroics. So in any case, you can see from Michael Oren's comments and anything else that you may have heard that the coverage of this march was really very decontextualized. And so today I'm going to spend some time offering a little bit of context. Now, one of the risks of focusing only on Palestine in these moments of spectacular violence is that we forget about the everyday forms of violence that Israel uses to govern not only the Gaza Strip, not only the West Bank, not only East Jerusalem, but all of historic Palestine. Nonetheless, it is useful to take a moment to remember all of the spectacular moments of violence that punctuate Israel's siege on the Gaza Strip over the last decade. Here they are behind me. We have Operation Cast Lead in 2008-2009. We have Operation Pillar of Cloud in Hebrew and English. They translated it for some reason to Pillar of Defense. And then Operation Protective Edge in English, in Hebrew Operation Strong Cliff. We can think about the translations there. In any case, these were very spectacular moments of violence when thousands of Palestinians were murdered, where the Gaza Strip was put under collective punishment. And so this most recent attack on the Great March of Return protesters should be understood in context with these spectacular moments of violence, and also in context of the ongoing Israeli blockade of the Gaza Strip, which again has been going on for more than a decade. And that's what I will talk mostly about today. Now, I have said this so far in my talk, but I will just take a moment to say again that Israel is a settler colonial project that is ongoing to this day. When I say settler colonial project, I mean a political project by which the state is trying to annex a maximum amount of territory with the minimum number of indigenous people. Now, the reasons behind this are they emerge from a complicated moment in history where ethnic nationalism and colonialism kind of merged in Europe to give way to this Zionist project that then takes root in historic Palestine. But in any case, this is the logic that guides Israel's policies and practices across historic Palestine, regardless of geography. So the end game is take the land without the people. And the land is from the Jordan River, to the Mediterranean Sea. All of it. Now, Israel uses a variety of tools in order to accomplish this ultimate goal. With the time that I have remaining, I'm just going to talk about two of those tools. One is borders, and the other is enclosures. Now, borders are a feature of statehood with which Israel has a very complicated relationship to. I say complicated because Israel refuses to define borders with Palestinians. It has a treaty with Egypt, a treaty with Jordan about those borders, but otherwise Israel does not recognize its own borders. That doesn't mean Israel doesn't use borders, as my students here will tell you. I should let you guys take over. Israel uses bordering and border logic across the territory of historic Palestine as ways of controlling Palestinian populations. Okay. There was something else I want to say. this is important to remember because, again, the coverage of what happened to the Great March of Return protesters will tell you that there were clashes at the border. What border? Ask a real Zionist if that's the end border of Israel. Ask them and see what they say. They will not tell you that that's the end of Israel. That's not the edge of it. Okay. This is what I mean when I say that Israel uses borders across historic Palestine. This is the view of just a segment of the separation wall that you find not along the edge of the West Bank, not at the geopolitical line between the West Bank and Israel, but inside the West Bank. This is just below Bethlehem, near a suburb of Bethlehem called Beit Jala. And it's just one example of many of Israel using physical barriers across the territory to disrupt the flow of Palestinian life. I am very happy to talk about this in the Q&A. This is my bread and butter. Okay. Now, the point of the bordering that Israel does, importantly, is that the bordering is for Palestinians. It's not for Israel. Israel crosses its own borders, and Israelis cross those borders all the time. That includes in Gaza, where Israel is constantly going into the territory of the Strip, around the territory of the Strip, above the territory of the Strip, below the territory of the Strip, etc., etc. Now, I've presented this amazing 3D image created by Gazan artist Mahmoud al-Arawi in 2012. This is still, I think, a decently representative, diagram of what's going on. The only thing that I want to add to the image is that one should not take literally the suspension of the Israeli presence as not quite touching the Strip itself. So you see the planes hovering, you see the tanks on one side, you see the ships on the other side, the warships. Yes, they surround the Gaza Strip like a, quote, open-air prison. You hear that all the time. But the effects of that blockade penetrate deep into the social life of the Gaza Strip at every register. Now, I'm using this as a way of transitioning into talking about what I call the Israeli Enclosures. And so this is the next tool that I talk about when I am describing the various tools that Israel uses to accomplish settler colonialism. I use the term enclosures for a variety of reasons because I think enclosures, some of you who've been attending the Red May events may be familiar with the term enclosures from the European context, from the British enclosures, the German enclosures. I use the term enclosure to represent what I actually interpret as a mobility regime where movement is controlled as part of a broader program to destroy the basis for economic self-sufficiency, destroy popular political power, destroy social cohesion, and destroy cultural resilience. And in this context, we're talking about enclosures that are being mobilized to carry out settler colonialism. I just like the word enclosures because it gets at all of those registers. Real diehard students of the enclosures probably don't like me using this word. But I use it, and I use it I see myself in the tradition of a variety of scholars who take that term and apply it to other contexts, such as Clyde Woods, who talks about the racial enclosures in New Orleans, et cetera, et cetera. So this is how I see Israel's policies or strategy, toward Palestinians across historic Palestine. Now, the way that the enclosures work differ from the Gaza Strip to the West Bank to East Jerusalem to, Palestinians who live in Greater Israel. That's part of the program. Part of the program is creating different categories of Palestinians that have different experiences, that then have different priorities for what to address, that then divide them politically. Okay, that's one of the effects of the enclosures. Of course, one of the main effects of the enclosures on Palestinian life is what Sarah Roy calls economic de-development in Palestine. And so here we're talking about a wholesale attack on every level of Palestinian economic independence. And so that program started across historic Palestine, not just in the Gaza Strip, with the destruction / expropriation of natural resources. In the Gaza Strip, that involved in 1967 Israel declaring that all of the water in the Gaza Strip is theirs. So Israel is now in control of all of the water, and Palestinians have to buy it from them at very high, very, very high prices in order to access it. Of course, Gaza is one of the poorest places in the world, so it's very difficult to actually get any of that. In addition, because of this is a sort of complicated history, but because of the inhibition and or destruction of infrastructure, sanitation control in Gaza is terrible, which has resulted in a lot of raw sewage, untreated sewage being pumped into the sea, which then seeps into the underground aquifers, resulting in a situation in which 98% of the water in Gaza is undrinkable. 98%. So we have a population of people who don't have enough water and have to buy it from a state that is trying to get rid of them. There's a variety of other dimensions to the health crisis that Gazans face, including starvation, which is the result of the Red Line program that Israel carried out, in which it actually calculated the minimum number of calories that Palestinians would need to be allowed to access. They counted the calories and they did some math to figure out how many trucks would need to be let in through Israel's blockade of the Gaza Strip. They came up with the number 170 trucks. But the math didn't stop there. The math then continued to make arguments about how the Gazans really should be growing their own agriculture, even though, as we said, the water is not usable for agriculture. And so now they let in 67 trucks. From the 170 that they calculated as the minimum number, they let in 67. Of those 67, untold numbers of those trucks spoil in the sunshine when they're being stopped for investigation by the Israeli military at the checkpoints, and so they're unusable. And so the things that get through are the things that are kept with sugar.
Preservatives.
Yeah. Preserved with sugars. Things that have a low nutritional value. And so there's not really a lot of nutrients getting into the Gaza Strip. I am way over time, so I will just quickly say that there's 44% unemployment rate in Gaza. Part of that is related to the fact that these natural resources and infrastructure have been systematically destroyed or inhibited for decades, but also because Israel, as they did in the West Bank, destroyed the basis for economic independence inside the Palestinian territories, and then in Gaza, unlike in the West Bank, routinely and disproportionately denied Gazan residents from getting permits to work inside Israel, where wages are 3 times what they are in the Palestinian territories. So they both created a situation of economic dependence, and then denied them access to the thing that they're dependent on, basically. This has in turn created a situation of political strife, where this undermines the basis of solidarity between Palestinians of different geographical places. Much is made of the tensions between Fatah, the ruling party in the West Bank, and Hamas, the ruling party in Gaza. Very little is made of the fact that Israel has created a situation of extreme scarcity and dependence, in which then Fatah and Hamas are just fighting over the tiny crumb that Israel has left them. So this is, for example, the if you read about water shortages or electricity and fuel shortages, you will see Fatah always being blamed for what's happening in Gaza. But the thing that you won't notice is that Fatah is refusing to pay Israel the exorbitant taxes so that Israel will provide the fuel to the Gaza Strip. Now, Fatah should pay the taxes or shouldn't pay the taxes. The point is that the taxes shouldn't be levied at all. Right. So these are some of the dimensions of Israeli enclosures that affect the Gaza Strip and affect all of historic Palestine. Through those strategies, we can see an emerging picture where there is where we notice Israel's concerted efforts to create a series of very unnatural disasters that result then in crisis in Gaza, crisis in various places across historic Palestine that then flare up, when there is some political violence or when there is some kinds of, not really natural disasters, they're all unnatural disasters, but some kinds of, attacks or moments of spectacular violence. So that is the main point, that Israel is really creating this background situation background situation of misery that then gets exacerbated at moments of spectacular violence. Okay, thank you very much for your patience.
Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Jose. I'm from Puerto Rico, and I'm going to tell you a story. I'm going to start with a story about how I became involved in this topic. I've actually been asked to talk about this before a long time ago, like 10 years ago almost. There was a Chicano-Palestinian Connections forum in Los Angeles that somebody invited me to, and they thought I was Chicano, so I said, okay, I'll go. And they had like the big reveal, like, I'm not Chicano, so I'm not going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about Latinx Palestinian Connections, which some people in LA do not like that word at all. And specifically Puerto Rican. So I started thinking about it at that time, but I've been thinking about Palestine for a long time because I actually, before this life, I used to be an aspiring archaeologist, and I worked for 4 summers total in that region. And I worked actually very close to Gaza. So I'll tell you a story about that in a second, but just a quick disclaimer, I'm always uneasy to make this comparison because I see very little kind of equivalences. These are not strictly comparable in the sense that there's a lot of differences in the context of what happens in Puerto Rico and what happens in Gaza, but that's not to say that they're unrelated, right? There is a relationship, and it is a relationship, or a fancier term, a relationality, that I discovered kind of serendipitously when I was trying to be an archaeologist, and I was literally trying to stick my head in the sand and not pay attention to the contemporary colonialism that was going on in Puerto Rico, right? So I started working. I'm glad there's a board here because I need to. I like maps a lot. So this is basically kind of that's the Dead Sea. That's the Jordan River, right? So Gaza kind of goes like that. I worked in a place called Ashkelon, which is literally like 6 or 7 miles from Gaza. And we used to work in the ancient city of Ashkelon, which is right outside of the modern city. It's what, in archaeological language, it comes from Arabic, they call it a tell, right? Tell is like a little hill like that. But the cool thing about tells is that it looks like an innocent little hill, but it's really a layer cake of civilizations, right? It's an artificial hill because there's so many ruins, one on top of the other, that after a while it creates a hill. Now, Ashkelon is an interesting place because Gaza, Ashkelon, Ashdod, Ekron, and Gath, these are ancient cities. They are what they call the Philistine Pentapolis, the 5 Philistine cities. And what is the relationship between that and Palestine? Does anybody know? Kind of sounds similar, right?
Palestinians.
Right. That's where the name comes from, right? So Palestina was the original Latin name that the Romans gave it, but it's actually based on the ancient Greek name. And it's actually based on an ancient Hebrew word which literally means to invade invaders. The root word for the word Palestinian means invaders, right? Interesting, right? Were they invaders? When you actually study the archaeology of this region, you realize that there's no such thing, because in these layer cakes, what you have is multiple civilizations kind of vying for control over an area that was essentially a superhighway, right? So in ancient Ashkelon, you start with the Canaanites, right? You heard about the Canaanites in the Bible, right? And on top of that, then you have the sea peoples, the Philistines, right? That supposedly came from the upper Mediterranean. At the same time that these were Philistine cities, you had the beginnings of an ancient Judea that was very small in size and eventually actually fragmented into two kingdoms. So Judea and the kingdom of Israel, they had rival monarchs and everything. And there were a lot of powers kind of shuffling around, right? When you dig into these cities, you find these giant layers of ash that were basically destructions. So an Assyrian invasion, a Babylonian invasion, the Roman invasion, and you can tell in that layer cake where those invasions are. So when you look at the archaeological record, you realize that there's so much movement of peoples through here. It never really belonged to a people, right? The idea that there is an original people and then there are invaders themselves is a fabrication, it's a construction, right? At the same time, it's ironic because the current people that we refer to as Palestinians are not descended from foreigners, right? They're descended from all the people that kind of crossed over, including Jews in ancient times, right? So it's important to think about that when you're studying the archaeology. And archaeology over there, interestingly, we had this conversation the other day, it's so politicized. That's the other thing that you realize when you work there, that there are particular interests that want to highlight certain things that you find, and they want to downplay other things that you find. So for example, Ashkelon, it was actually the second most important city in that region after Al-Quds, after Jerusalem, during the time of the Crusades. It was the second capital of the Fatimid Empire in that region. In the contemporary archaeology, you almost never hear about that. It's almost like they tunnel through those remains, right? Because they want to get at the good stuff, which is the stuff that either validates the Bible or validates a Zionist claim over that land. Gaza, by the way, it was very very briefly part of Judea. And it was actually it ended up being the capital of the Nabatean Empire. The Nabatean are pre-Islamic Arabs, right, from the Arabian Peninsula. And they would use Gaza as the port to send all kinds of things from the Silk Route to Rome. It was a very important port city for the Nabateans. So that was one lesson that I learned when I worked there. But I just want to give you the mental picture. We're digging thousands of years back. We're digging all the way back to 2500, 3000 BCE, right? Wow. Finding Canaanite tombs. In an environment, by the way, where there were a lot of Hasidic Jews that hate archaeologists because they have this understanding that if you disturb a burial, you're disturbing that person's chances of being basically resuscitated when the Mashiach comes, the Messiah. So it was a very tense environment. Like, a lot of people did not want us to get, and we were saying like, oh, we're digging ancient Canaanites. Don't worry, this was like 1,000 years before there were any Jews here, right? In that end, with fighter jets doing sonic booms above our heads, and with an artillery base nearby, hearing artillery, right? And with Gaza, literally like 6 miles down the beach that we were in, right? And in that experience, I couldn't help thinking of what was going on at that particular moment in Puerto Rico, which was, there was an eruption of activism around the target practicing of the U.S. Navy in the island of Vieques in Puerto Rico, right? And eventually, it was really hard for me to not put two and two together in terms of seeing that we were dealing with situations of colonialism and militarism, right? But the resemblances, I won't say that they end there, right? But there's a lot of differences. And it was later on when I realized that I should, instead of sticking my head in the sand in Palestine, I should be sticking my head in the books about the Caribbean and Latin America, and change profession, basically. That I started thinking about some of the other connections, which is what I want to highlight today, some of the other relationships. So what I always tell my students when I get to talk about Palestine is that I see settler colonialism in Palestine as the limit case to what you can get away with in the 20th century when it comes to colonialism, particularly in the post-UN Charter and post-1960 UN decolonization resolution world, right? If you can get away with that, you can get away with anything, right? Mm-hmm. So we have to focus on that because it makes no sense to try to like legitimately decolonize on other things or other places when that continues to happen and it's officially sanctioned, right? And not just officially sanctioned, but officially paid for with our tax dollars. And so in one sense, there's that connection, and that form of settler colonialism is certainly partly inspired by settler colonialism in the Americas in general, and particularly in the United States. So it's partly produced by that, but it also reproduces it backwards. It reproduces the legitimizing of colonialism over here by us claiming, well, what those people are doing over there, in part with our help, is perfectly fine and it's perfectly justifiable, right? And there's certain legal and theoretical underpinnings that account for that normally we don't get to think about because you have to like seriously geek out and look at the history of this in order to understand it, right? The reason why settler colonialism is still currently legal, basically, we have a settler colonial relationship with indigenous peoples in the United States, is, and it seems bizarre, but it goes all the way back to the doctrine of discovery, which is a medieval concept, right? That the conquistadors came up with in the 15th and 16th century to legitimize the conquest of the Americas, right? And this is when the law was not separated from the church, and they were trying to figure out what was morally, allowed. And it was basically drawing on an even older notion of just war. What is just war? What makes war just, right? And there were certain criteria back then that all these priests were discussing, and one of them was, well, if you're just hanging out, like trying to see who you can trade with, and somebody attacks you, and you act in defense, you can act in aggression in defense, and if you end up somehow occupying or taking over their land, that land becomes yours, right? So, which is why the conquistadors after that would claim, oh, I was just hanging out, these people attacked me, I killed them, I ended up with that. Or the other one was that if people are doing like morally reprehensible things, such as, and this is how the Spanish conquistadors would talk, either sodomites or cannibals. If there were sodomites or cannibals, you can take over the land. You're good. You're good. So eventually, we actually talk about doctrine of discovery when we study settler colonialism in the United States, because that happened a long time ago. But the Supreme Court, when the United States was already a liberal republic, said, well, we kind of ended up with these territories that were taken over legally according to that precept. So now they belong to us legitimately, right? And what that does is that it creates kind of this impression that those acts were defensive, those acts were originally justified, therefore the reverberations of them in the present are justified, right? The other logic was John Locke's theory of property, right? The idea that private property materializes when you expend your individual labor in a property, in a piece of land, right? So somehow the idea is that your property is your body, and by working the land, you like magically transfer your property into the land, right? And any smart person thinks like, well, doesn't that mean that then the land belongs to the slaves? Or well, it's
right.
They kind of bullshit their way through that by claiming, well, originally it was like that, but then you would acquire wealth, and then with that wealth you could buy labor or you could buy slaves, and then it's still legitimately yours, right?
It's an extension of you. Yeah.
Right, but this is important because this logic was also used not just in the United States but also in Israel, and then this idea that a land without a people without a land and a land without people, right? This idea that this was land that didn't really belong to anybody until the Zionist settlers took over it, which is absolute historical fiction, right? Because people are definitely farming there, right? But so these things, there are kind of undergirding logics, and what this does is that it creates this concept of kind of the legitimate conqueror and kind of the somehow suspect, savage, barbaric, or barbaric local indigenous person, right? Somehow cast as a public enemy, the original concept of a terrorist, right?
Responsible for their
And even though it seems like the situation in Palestine and Puerto Rico are very different, right? We do have reverberations of that in Puerto Rico. We do have reverberations of criminalizing any kind of opposition to that taking over, of legitimizing it, of criminalizing it, right? Of anybody who effectively tries to challenge the United States occupation of Puerto Rico in the past has been criminalized, right? Incarcerated, intimidated, disarticulated. There was a time in which even this flag, the Puerto Rican flag, was actually banned, right? Which I saw an interesting video the other day of peaceful protesters in Israel, inside Israel, in Jerusalem, with Palestinian flags, and police officers yanking the flags from their hands. And it reminded me of when that used to happen in Puerto Rico, right?
which is why Puerto Ricans are so into their flag.
Right. So to me, it's important to think about that because I think coming from a Puerto Rican perspective, Puerto Ricans sometimes, I think this happens when you're from an island. We tend to have a very kind of insular understanding of what happens around us. We don't even know what's happening in the Dominican Republic sometimes. It's literally right next to us, right? We don't even have what's happening. We don't even know what's happening in the U.S. Virgin Islands, which is another American colony, which is even closer to us distance-wise, right?
That's a part of a technique like you're talking about.
And it's important for us to realize that there is a relationality here. There are underlying logics that account for these disparate outcomes, right? That we are not the only people in the United States, right, that have a kind of second-class citizenship, a second-class treatment, right? And that at the same time, there are cases in which that second-classness and that legitimization of a colonial relationship leads to insane concentrations of violence and insane concentrations of ethnic cleansing, genocide, right? That are made to be legal, right? In the world, and that are naturalized, that are officially sanctioned by the U.S. government, officially sanctioned by some of the U.S. government's allies. And if that happens over there, it's no surprise that you have the kind of disparate treatment that Puerto Rico got during the hurricane, right? So my other job right now is to briefly introduce the history of how Puerto Rico ended up being a colony. This is an image right after the hurricane. So 1898, one thing that a lot of people in the United States never learn about in school is the Spanish-American War. Speaking of defensive, right? This is one of those classic U.S. wars where they were just supposedly hanging out and they got attacked, and then that gives them a legitimate reason to attack back and keep whatever they acquire, right? Which is how Puerto Rico ended up being war booty, because supposedly the Spaniards blew up an American Navy vessel in the Bay of Havana, the USS Maine. We actually know that that's bullshit. So we know that either it blew up by itself, which is archaeologists have actually studied this, and it's the most likely explanation that it was an accident, or that it was intentionally blown up. But we know that the Spaniards had nothing to do with blowing up this vessel, right? And there's a pattern here, right? I don't know if you know that the Mexican-American War, which was before this,
It's also
when Abraham Lincoln was an aspiring politician, one of his catchphrases was "Show me the spot where supposedly in the Nueces River where supposedly the Mexican forces attacked us," right? Because there was a political debate as to whether the United States actually had a legitimate reason to declare war on Mexico. And there were people that were claiming that this supposed attack was fabricated. It was a pretext for entering that war and for annexing the Mexican territory, right? So there's a long pattern of the United States doing this whole thing like, we're just hanging out, we got attacked. And we attacked, and we kept what we had, right? And it's no coincidence that, by the way, the Israeli military is called the Israeli Defense Forces, right? We're just defending ourselves, right? We're just hanging out here, we got attacked, we struck back, and then we ended up keeping this place, right? In other words, it's a playbook. It's a classic move, right? So Puerto Rico becomes war booty, and they wouldn't have kept Cuba because Cuba was actually fighting a very bloody war of independence that the Cuban insurgents were about to win. It was extremely bloody. This is where the Spaniards used very brutal reconcentration tactics, mass starvation. But the rebels were ultimately almost successful, and then the United States came in and basically finished off the Spanish enemy. But they basically had a standing army. So the U.S. said, it's probably not a good idea to try to take over Cuba. They have a standing army. They also took over the Philippines. They also took over Guam. Around the same time, there was a coup in Hawaii that ended up also annexing the sovereign kingdom of Hawaii. And eventually they ended up acquiring other territories in the Pacific and also the U.S. Virgin Islands. So I'm going to skip over all this. In 1917, the United States...
the Merchant Marine Act.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that.
Yeah.
In 1917, the United States realized that if they didn't do something to give Puerto Rican citizenship, they were going to get into a lot of problems because nationalism was ascendant. This is the origins of the Nationalist Party in Puerto Rico. So as a kind of symbolic gesture of appeasement, they created this new type of citizenship that comes with a lot less privileges, a lot less protections as it applies to the overseas territories, right? Then they signed, this is actually an across-the-board law that was signed in the United States that has greatly affected the Puerto Rican economy. This was basically a kind of subsidization of the American ship industry, the merchant marines, right? And what it does is that in any U.S. port, it makes it illegal for a foreign vessel to offload and unload cargo. You can just offload, but you can't do both, right? So this is a kind of protectionist policy for the U.S. Shipping fleet. It applies to Puerto Rico, right? So this is one of those things that it applies to Puerto Rico, even though Puerto Ricans never voted for anybody that made this decision, and they can't vote for anybody that will change it, right? And being an island, it disproportionately affects the economy because everything has to be brought in by ship. You can't bring things in by rail. You can't bring in things by truck. Everything is brought in by ship. And American vessels are the most expensive vessels in the world, and they are scarce. There's not that many of them. And you can't use the natural ports in Puerto Rico in a strategic location smack in the middle of the Caribbean Atlantic for transshipment. Right? So it cripples the economy in that sense. And we'll talk about why this is a big deal right now. So you had a nationalist movement that was met with a lot of violent repression. You had, in the era of the post-UN Charter, when colonialism started to get kind of a bad name, you had a kind of window dressing of the colonial relationship by rebranding it in corporate style, right? Rebranding it as a commonwealth. And in Spanish, the name is even more ironic because it's supposed to be a free associated state, but it's not free. It's not associated in a bilateral way, and it's definitely not a state, right? And Puerto Rico was used as a colonial laboratory for many things. Now people still talk about the outsourcing of industrial jobs to the global south. Puerto Rico was used as a laboratory for outsourcing, seeking cheaper production costs, cheaper labor, and also the outsourcing of American products, right, to create consumers in places where people don't speak English, etc. There's also a lot of dependence on large industries that don't really leave a lot of money in Puerto Rico and don't really leave a lot of jobs. Also dependence in tourism. And this is, before we talk about Hurricane Maria, I want you to understand that Puerto Rico was already facing a Category 5 economic hurricane, right? The Puerto Rican economy has been in a legit depression. A depression means a 10-year plus economic recession. The Puerto Rican economy has been facing a legit depression. And with the negative growth in the economy, there's also been a spiking of personal and public debt, right? And this creates a lot of problems because the Puerto Rican government has tried to use kind of Keynesian policies to revive the local economy by being the largest employer, by using public spending. And in part, it's because of that they've racked up so much debt, right? And they have been unable to resuscitate the patient. And they basically ran out of things that they can do, right? Now they're completely cash-strapped, and they're at the mercy of banks, hedge funds that are cutting up, this debt into little pieces and trying to recuperate as much money as possible. So this is the debt to GDP ratio for most U.S. states, and this is where Puerto Rico's debt is in comparison to everything else. This is the average U.S. state, right? So it ends up being about $22,000 per person, right? The other problem that we have is that Puerto Rico, because of the bad economy, is massively depopulating. People are leaving. So when I grew up there, the population was 3.9 million. Right now it's 3.4, and it's projected to become 3.2 and then 3 million. And when you have a dwindling population, you have a lot of trouble reviving the economy, right? And this was before the hurricane. Before the hurricane, there were 85,000 people a year leaving. Okay, after the hurricane, it has doubled, tripled, right? And Jade is going to pick up now. Jade, you want to talk about this, or?
Yeah.
This is where Puerto Ricans end up in. So it's not just the East Coast. There's also a lot in the West Coast now. These are concentrations of Puerto Ricans in different counties, right? And don't forget that Puerto Ricans are the second largest Latinx population in the United States after people of Mexican ancestry, right? Sorry. Puerto Ricans also, interestingly, they are some of the poorest ethnic groups in the United States. And Puerto Ricans evidence that citizenship or papers are important, but they're not everything. Because you can immigrate to the United States with papers or with citizenship in this case and still be at the bottom of the social hierarchy, right? It depends on how you are segregated, what kind of jobs you are targeted for, right? Et cetera, et cetera. We're just skipping through these because we ran out of time.
All right. Thank you, Jose. So my name is Jade, and I'm gonna follow up with Jose, but I just want to tell you first that I come to this work as a performance scholar, a cultural studies scholar. So and I study, Puerto Rican performance, cultural production, Latinx cultural production in general, and all of this has a great impact on what is happening culturally, what is happening in terms of artists' work, but also artists and cultural workers have responded to all of this and have generated some of the most critical responses to these twin hurricanes that we're calling them. So I'm just going to follow up here, and then I'm not going to talk for too long, so that y'all been sitting for a while, so that we can get some questions going on. Okay, and you hear us all trying to share so much with you because these are very complex situations, and so much layering of knowledge is necessary to be able to understand what's happening. So this is from this part of the slideshow. Important takeaways: U.S. colonialism drives underdevelopment, poverty, insecurity, and disproportionate vulnerability to natural disasters, as we've been saying. The citizenship is not viewed as this privileged status. This is going to become important after Hurricane Katrina, Hurricane Maria. Okay, let's see. Why is it so weird like that?
Because we have to change the format.
Oh, okay. All right. So our twin hurricanes, and I want to just emphasize what Jose said about the Exodus. And this morning I read a statistic that said by the end of 2019 the population will have decreased 14% since 2017. So, but what does that actually mean, right? What does that actually mean? It makes it difficult to rebuild a population, to rebuild the economy. It also means, back to what Maryam was saying, what happens when you remove people? What do you need to be able to claim land? You need to remove people, right? And so this is, there are all these reasons why we see this happening, but it is nothing short of a systematic depopulation of Puerto Rico. And those of us that are in the diaspora, right, those of us that are in the diaspora recognize the fact that we're here, we're not over there, and recognize the reasons why. Because it is very, very difficult to contend with all of the various factors, to even try to just have a basic job, to have a house, to have access to medical care. And one of the things that not enough is covered is the fact that the population of Puerto Rico right now is an aging population. Those are the people who have not left, who don't want to leave because they've been here their whole life, or it's just too complicated, and I have my pension, my small pension, whatever, I'm not going. But what does that mean? That strains the economy even more, and all of the young people who could be helping to build the economy are not there. So let's see. Hurricane Maria as a racial colonial emergency. And it's part of what also we're talking about, these sort of these punctuations where all of a sudden Puerto Rico's in the news. And for me, it was really interesting, this moment post-Hurricane Maria, when all of a sudden Puerto Rico's in the news. It's like, oh, you're talking about Puerto Rico now? Oh. But, and it becomes this, this rhetoric of, but Puerto Ricans are citizens. We really need to care about our fellow citizens. And there's two things wrong with that argument, right? On the one hand, it's, if they weren't, should we just not care about them, right? But the other hand is, but it's a second-class citizenship, and it always has been, and this is just, we're proving it again. And it's the slippage between Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Maria is perhaps instructive here, that it's the same kind of certain lives matter more than others, right? And here, of course, is Donald Trump and the paper towels that was made famous. But what I want to say about this image also is the way that it's circulated as a way for the left to critique Donald Trump. In many ways, more than it was circulated as a way to talk about what was happening in Puerto Rico, right? And what that kind of neglect actually means. So it's a way to talk about how neglectful Donald Trump is, not that Puerto Ricans are being neglected, right? So just bringing our attention to that. Right, and then of course contrasted Puerto Rico's death toll to what do we call a real catastrophe like in Katrina. The question of the death toll is still something that is being figured out, and the moment that Trump's plane left Puerto Rico, the death toll shut up, the official death toll, and they think that it's in the could be over 1,000, right? And these are also deaths that how do we track these deaths? What does death because of the hurricane actually look like? What does it mean when you can't have access to your medicines? What does it mean when someone's sleep apnea machine, there's no power for the sleep apnea machine? I saw a really disturbing tweet that said, how can we think about Eric Garner here? What does it mean to not be able to breathe because of this kind of a crisis? Right, and so the death, and there's suicide too, right? There's suicide. We're talking about a whole island that is dealing with, and still coming to be able to name the fact that a lot of people are dealing with this post-traumatic stress, right? So what are the outcomes? Is this okay? The unnatural fatalities. Natural causes, right? Because a lot of these deaths were supposedly deemed natural that could have been prevented with adequate infrastructure and healthcare. Violence. So we were talking about this yesterday, so Jose and I are married, if you can figure that out. And we were talking about children and guns, and how to just having a zero tolerance policy about our son playing with guns. And Jose was talking about having grown up in San Juan at a time where there was a lot of violence, a lot of gun violence, especially. And we're seeing this kind of reemerge because of the insecurity, right? And so part of this is challenging to us because it helps to reproduce this idea of, again, the terrorists that always the colonial subject always responsible for their own demise, right? They're killing themselves. They've put themselves into debt. They've created this situation. If they had prepared better for the hurricane, if their electric grid was more updated, if the government had been able to invest in the electric grid as opposed to in paying off the debt, maybe things would have been different, right? So all of this idea that it's their fault, and so this is just the natural order of things. So when we see this kind of violence and insecurity emerge, it also helps to feed that rhetoric. But the reality is that there's a lot of violence and a lot of insecurity. The education system, it is the massive closings of public schools, underpaid teachers, especially this is the new push for voucherization and charterization. And the public university system, the University of Puerto Rico, which is a very good university system, several campuses have closed, is massively underfunded, even though they continue to work miracles and continue to create new research projects around the aftermath of the hurricane. And that I'm getting to that now in terms of what people... All right, so there's more into what people have done in response to broken healthcare, and the devastation of cultural institutions. This is really important because when you get the formation of the Commonwealth in 1952, you get this, you're not going to be your own nation. You don't get to do that. But we're going to give you, you can have your own culture. So cultural nationalism becomes the organizing tissue for much of Puerto Rican identity, but also a labor, right? There's so many cultural workers that are funded through the government that circulate all around the island, and cultural institutions following the debt crisis and Hurricane Maria have been devastated, not to mention a lot of archives just sopping wet, and without the resources to actually salvage them. Small business bankruptcies, and this is a really, really big one. A lot of like mom and pop restaurants, food stands. Oh, a tree fell on it. Okay, well, that's that, right? And people, those are the people that are packing up and leaving, or waiting for FEMA. A lot of FEMA claims, like 76% of FEMA claims, are not accepted because also there are certain building permits are not regulated in the same ways, which in fact were not regulated in the same ways because people were just building a second story onto their mom's house as a way to solve what was largely a housing crisis that the government needed to become responsible for, but they didn't, and so people just did it on their own, and then they don't have deeds, right? They don't have the permits, they don't have the deeds, so that they can't actually claim anything with FEMA. They can't get anything out of these claims because they don't have the paperwork that to prove it, and the depopulation. Let's see, disaster capitalism, of course, when you get these outsiders coming in and capitalizing literally on this disaster. We saw this with the company that, what was it? The company that Trump brought in, ¿cómo se llama? The power company that that was like
they had this company that had never done anything related to restoring power before Whitefish.
Whitefish, yeah.
Massive contract.
Yeah. So just but also because people are leaving, right? So then it's like, oh great, there's all these Puerto Ricans here. We're gonna there are all these unemployed Puerto Ricans, cheap labor source. So so then that kind of spills into the mainland economy in a particular way that is not new, right? Could boost small town USA.
There's towns that are actively recruiting cheap Puerto Rican workers, rural towns, and this has been happening for decades. Puerto Rican migrant workers have most of the 20th century, but it has really picked up since the hurricane.
Right, so we see this, and sort of Puerto Rico all of a sudden kind of jumps onto the front page, goes from this colonial invisibility. Where is Puerto Rico? I can't tell you how many of my students, and don't tell me if you're one of them, because you're here today, but I can't tell you how many of my students are like, where is Puerto Rico? I'm like, what is it? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
They
Yeah.
think it's Costa Rica, or they think it's Puerto Vallarta in Mexico.
Or maybe Cuba, or like, they're not really sure. Right, so where is Puerto Rico? Why does it matter? Who cares? Why should the media cover it? So to now, or to this distorted and opportunist, like, hyper-visibility. Oh, Puerto Rico. And the different treatments have included mainland politicians. Oh, we need to help our fellow Americans over there, right? And then end up doing nothing. Or the missionary narrative, let's save those poor Puerto Ricans and show them how great, we Americans, we don't let our own fall. Or, well, that's got it. We're gonna help Puerto Ricans by setting up tax shelters, cryptocurrency, and like there's a guy at the coffee shop we go to. He's like, yeah, my friend went down there. He's working there. Basically, one of these opportunists that are just kind of cashing in on the really low cost for purchasing a house at this point. Now with the gig economy and with the tech and everything and cryptocurrency, it is
Some people want to make it
a paradise.
Cryptocurrency utopia.
Yeah. And this is, and I also want to make sure that we don't let the local Puerto Rican government off the hook because they suck. And they're really, really, really corrupt, which is not unusual in colonial situations, right? There's a reason for that. And again, not because Puerto Ricans are inherently, ungovernable and unable to self-govern, but rather because the conditions of colonialism produce this kind of scrambling for scraps. And then, problems with why has recovery been so difficult and continues to be so difficult, right? We're many months in at this point. Local political disorganization, the Jones Act that Jose talked about, problems with FEMA claims. But who is saving Puerto Rico? Puerto Ricans, right? And when I say Puerto Ricans, I mean the diaspora and islanders. And especially islanders on the ground in their own communities. They're the ones that cleared all the roads, picked up all the escombros, what do you say, the brush and the fallen trees and everything. They're the ones that are fighting for their schools not to be closed. They're the ones that are giving each other therapy. They're the ones that are artists that are going to these really small communities and holding these, doing drama therapy with all of these women that are terrified by the slightest noise outside when there's wind, of the sound of wind flapping against tin roofs, right? That now is a trigger for this traumatic memory. So they're the ones that are actually doing this hard work daily, visiting elders, a lot of women also, largely women. Taller Salud became really big in the news because they were collecting a lot of donations. Taller Salud is an organization from Loíza, which is on the kind of northeast coast, in this known for its large black population, and underserved, no access to health care, etc. Taller Salud has been around for decades. Right? Taller Salud has taken up the task in a post-hurricane moment of extending that work. Another really important thing that's happened has been the agriculture. Right? So agriculture has been wiped out of Puerto Rico for decades, essentially, and everything has to be imported. And
85% of food or more is imported.
And they're talking about a place where food grows. Food grows like that. So the fact that 85% of everything is imported is ridiculous. So there has been a recent movement in the last 10 years or so to reinvest in small farmers and local agriculture. And of course that was all wiped out with the hurricane. But because that movement is really strong, that is a big source of growth right now currently. These are the people that are doing this work, and the artists. Right? Of course, the artists are not getting paid, or and have to leave the island and then come back. We have a friend. She lives on the island. She's a musician. She gigs outside. She comes back. But they are the ones that are actually holding together this kind of like tissue of belonging and this hope for perhaps this kind of idea of yo no me quito. I'm not quitting, right? Because it is very tempting to leave. And again, as Jose and I, stand here in Seattle as members of this diaspora, we've left. Right? We left a long time ago for different reasons, but we're also not going back at this point. But I guess I will just end, right? Like I can't see the time. Right. So Yo no me quito, local grassroots organizations. I will just end by saying that I think that in both the case of Palestine and in the case of Puerto Rico, what can we do, right? What can we do here? And how can, besides informing ourselves, I think that's the first step, right, is to really be deeply informed. But how can we work to be in relation to these places? And in critical relation, right? So it's not just that we understand what our personal life might have to do with this other situation here, right? And how can we see ourselves in relationship to this larger picture, as opposed to just being like, those poor Puerto Ricans and those poor Palestinians. So thank you, and we'll open up to questions.
So I have a question, more for Puerto Rico than for Palestine. How can we, as we go forward into climate change having more of an obvious effect on certain areas?
Oh, yeah.
How do we make a differentiation between environmentally displaced people, which, Puerto Ricans can kind of be under that heading, or people who are being displaced as a result of settler colonialism? Well,
I would say, and actually, I wanted to talk about that. Thank you for reminding me. So people are currently preparing for another hurricane season. That's like what's happening right now. People are currently preparing for another hurricane season, and just even the thought of another hurricane season is making people leave. So I would say my answer to that would be that the displacement is an economic displacement. The displacement is not because of the hurricane. You have a natural disaster. Say we had a natural disaster in Seattle. Most people would not leave. They would rebuild. Right? So I think that I don't know, maybe you. I would say that the displacement is entirely.
I lived through various hurricanes in Puerto Rico at a time when, there's always been a circular migration between the island of Puerto Rico and the U.S. mainland, but you never heard about a massive exodus, and you never heard about these ridiculous blackouts. Part of the reason why the blackout is so bad, sure, the hurricane was big, but part of it is also that the electrical system was completely destroyed already.
Yeah.
Because of the debt of the Power Authority. The Power Authority, the $72 billion debt that the Puerto Rican government has, a significant chunk of it, about 13 to 15 billion, comes from the power company. And they have never, as a public utility company, they have never had the money to retrofit their system, to update it, to even change the source of the energy. The majority of the energy comes from petroleum. With one coal plant, which is horrible in an island, they have virtually no renewable energy. They've been trying to do natural gas, and they can't even change over to natural gas because they don't have the money for it. And by kilowatt, the electricity in Puerto Rico was already one of the most expensive, if not the most expensive, in all of the United States. Because when you get electricity from petroleum, it's way more expensive than in most other places. So it's an unnatural disaster in the sense that, sure, the hurricane destroys poles, it destroys all that. But if that would have happened 30, 40 years ago, when that system was relatively new, it would have been a whole different story.
It wouldn't have taken months.
Yeah, it wouldn't have taken months to restore it, right? And like you say, people leave because they don't believe that the economy will recover from this. They were already leaving before because they didn't think, because of the level of debt, we're talking about $22,000 per person in a place where the GMP per capita is about $15,000 a year, right? They didn't believe that the economy could recover before the hurricane, you know?
And I want to just add to that too, that so, and this is part of being a colonial subject, and part of this larger, the ways in which colonialism is internalized. Puerto Ricans are the worst consumers of electricity. Like, Puerto Rico consumes more electricity than anywhere in the Caribbean. Like, no one turns the lights off. People leave their air conditioning running. You know, and I'm not saying this to like give you the wrong idea. I'm talking. This is like this mentality of like, it's really complicated, but it's a mentality that comes with, you know, I don't have all these other things. I'm gonna have my AC on all day. Right. And so
conspicuous consumption.
It's a conspicuous. It's a very sort of, especially in the metropolitan area in San Juan, there's this consumerism that has been piped in through American companies, through American television, and it has really produced this subject that is not willing to look at their own situation. Rather, they would rather just sort of kind of like feed into this larger desire for accumulation of objects and image, right? So.
Yeah. And the marketing is at a whole other level.
Yeah.
I mean, you see things in Puerto Rico that you never see in the United States. Like everywhere you go, like you go to a men's bathroom and in the urinals, there's like plasma screens right in front of you, like selling you things, including in the holidays. Jade and I go a lot of times in the holidays, you know. Take out a personal loan and buy all your family gifts as you pee, you know. Look at this ad from the bank. Take out a personal loan, right? And it's important to underline that, because it's not just that the government is in debt. The personal debt is huge. So some people go to Puerto Rico and they're like, I don't know, I don't think people are that poor over there. You know, I saw cars, I saw people, you know, with cell phones or whatever.
It's all debt.
Because it's a party of debt, you know? So many people are in serious debt, right? And the same thing that led to this crisis, by the way, we didn't talk about that. But the reason why Puerto Rico got so much bond money is because since 1917, when Puerto Ricans got U.S. citizenship, they decided to make Puerto Rican bonds and other overseas colonies bonds triple tax exempt, which meant it was originally a way to supposedly ease acquiring credit for these relatively poor governments. If you want to build a road, take out bond money, build the road. But what ended up happening is that this became a sweet deal for Wall Street, because they can stuff these bonds into people's portfolios, and supposedly in the safe bond market, they would make more money because they were paying less. They were paying no taxes. You pay no local tax, no state tax, no federal tax, right? So they were sticking these in everybody's retirement portfolio, and it's basically like giving a poor person unlimited amounts of credit cards. But it's different because credit cards are supposed to be risky. In the bond market, which is supposedly the most risk-free market, right? And when this gets out of control, nobody reins it in, similar to the subprime crisis, right? Instead of having a reconstruction plan where the federal government just says, okay, the economy crashed, we need to inject some money, we need a stimulus here, let's put some taxpayer money to revive this economy, their approach is punitive. And it's based on this cultural perception that Puerto Ricans are a bunch of lazy spendthrifts, right? And it's all their fault. You know, we're going to discipline these people. They went overboard with their debt. Screw them. They're going to pay every dollar back, you know?
They're the Greeks of America, right?
Yeah, exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So, two comments on a question. So the first is that, the first comment is just that in terms of natural disasters, I want to remind, I was in Hawaii, and we had a hurricane, we had typhoon. Daily life was very hard. I mean, $7 per gallon. Average wages are very low. It's not the highest property. But Hawaii also,
Is that like
up to
colonialism?
9/11, was a sort of Californian rich people's destination. You have places which are too rich to qualify for support because there is one Hollywood person whose income is added to the income of the other 35 people, 40 people who live in the same district who earn $20,000 and try and make it, and the average income is considered to be so high that they couldn't tell. And none of the hurricanes and typhoons which people are also subject to ever resulted in anything in Waikiki, ever, even for 24 hours, going without tears. So we just need to remember that it's not the hurricane,
it's possible.
It's your ability to deal with it.
Right.
And the idea of natural disasters goes back to after its war of independence, Bangladesh has been always seen as the basket case that is filled with people who died in floods all the time. I mean, it's not like these people who lived there for generations don't know what a floodplain is. It's that the rest of the land has been taken away for industrial
Exactly.
Yeah. Which brings me to the second comment in terms of what I saw as very similar and linked to Marx. If I can just mention an article, it's called Primitive Accumulation and the Formation of Difference. It's a link to Marxism. And it's by Gavin Walker. And what Gavin Walker points out is that primitive accumulation is often assumed to be something that you bring in order to explain the origin of capital. And it's the first one, and it's settler colonialism is about primitive accumulation. But he says, what you have to understand is that the same processes that Marx is describing in primitive accumulation are the processes that Carl Schmitt is describing in the securitization of national borders. And that part of what's happening is that when you engage in primitive accumulation, you're talking about taking the land, but you've got to deal with the fact that in many cases, the people you took the land from haven't disappeared. Right? That is the story we tell in England is that they all become members of the working class. But of course, the Palestinians don't automatically join the Israeli wage labor. And so the primitive accumulation and formation of difference is that the classic British case was not even the classic British case once you consider Ireland and Scotland.
Right.
But that primitive accumulation is tightly linked to the ongoing and permanent formation of substandard human beings, cultural differences, underwritten in the naturalization of difference. Which brings me to my question. I know that the economic strangle on both the colonies, both the settler colonial spaces, has been very tight. And so in terms of that, I'd like to actually ask Maryam a little bit about what I know to be a lot of people pay attention to the settlements. And so in addition to the settlements, I know there's also been the more overt things like burning of olive groves and the denial of water rights. I was hoping to talk a bit about that. And for Puerto Rico, I really wanted to ask about the Jones Act because I know that is something we here can do something about, including many of our left-wing representatives like Camilla Jeffal actually support the Jones Act, which prevents, which you had mentioned.
Yeah, we had a conversation with her about it.
Yeah, and because what that meant is through the entire catastrophe, they never lifted the Jones Act. So you still really could only depend on American ships being available to even get food into the island.
That whole thing about, why isn't the stuff getting there? But why isn't the stuff getting there? Well, it was because it was waiting for these American ships to do it. When all these other people were lined up to ship in supplies. All these other countries. Yeah, thank you.
Charter, thank you so much for that question. Picking and choosing what to include in this little talk is very difficult. So I appreciate the alley-oop. I wanted to talk about one of the things that I cut was the ways that Israeli settled colonialism deals differently with Palestinian economic interest depending on the particular geography. And I'm more familiar with the case in the West Bank, which sort of gets launched in 1967 with Israel's invasion of the West Bank, and goes through a sort of rocky period at first where the Israelis are trying to figure out how they can set up infrastructure across the West Bank to sort of impose a permanent presence there, while at the same time Israel is telling the international community, we're going to be here for a little bit, then we're leaving. That was a lie. And here we are many, many decades later. In any case, one of the early strategies that Israel hits upon is how to induce economic dependence on Israel. In other words, break the Palestinian ability to be self-sufficient. And my students will recognize this from when we read Silvia Federici and talked about the enclosures that do the same thing to peasants, to undermine their ability to be economically self-sufficient, which is integral to their ability to pose a serious political resistance. Right. If you can't be economically self-sufficient, then you can't. It's very hard to resist the entity that you are now dependent upon. So this happens in the West Bank first in a similar way to Gaza that I talked about earlier, which is the destruction of natural resources and the destruction of all kinds of ways that people are supporting themselves, including through agriculture. That tactic was very successful across the West Bank, which included, similarly to Gaza, the stealing of all of the water and the stealing of a lot of arable land, but also includes, as Charu gestured toward, the destruction of actual trees, like the destruction of actual agricultural product. So just a few days ago, there was a report of one of the most extreme incidents of what is an ongoing pattern, which is Israeli settlers destroying Palestinian orchards and other kinds of groves. This is very typically targeted against olive trees, and we hear about the olive trees, which have a very important economic and cultural role in West Bank Palestinian life, not only because of the olive fruit and the oil that they produce, but also because of the olive wood, which is coming from ancient trees that are sustainably harvested and support a gigantic industry of olive wood crafts in the West Bank. But those are not the only things that are targeted. So recently there was a story of, it's really sad. A person who lives in Hebron, actually in the hills of Hebron, who would go to his grape orchards, day after day after day after day, a grape orchard that was 15 years old, and the grape harvest is coming up in a month or two, and basically one day he was there and the next day he goes, just like every day, and he finds that 400 of his grape plants were completely destroyed in a systematic way where they were slashed from trunk to trunk. They were slashed up the trunk, like in ways
with a chainsaw.
In a chainsaw, in ways that they, and not just someone flying
Wildly.
a chainsaw around, very calculated to make sure that none of the plants could grow back. So this is 15 years. It takes between 3 and 5 years for an olive plant to even bear fruit, that you could sell. So that's already 3 to 5 years of no income from this orchard, plus another 10 years to get to the quality of the orchard that he had, destroyed in a matter of an hour maybe. And of course, who is positioned right next to the grove? The Israeli military. Of course, this is Hebron. Well, this is all of historic Palestine. So the Israeli military has an installation which the owner of the orchard says is very quick to come and harass them if they ever go onto their orchard at night. They're not allowed to go onto their own territory at night, according to the Israeli military, because it poses a security threat, like all of Palestinian life. But the military didn't see anything. As 400 grape plants were being chainsawed to death, they didn't see or hear a thing. And so the people who are responsible for this destruction and loss of income will never be held accountable. Surveillance for some and not for others. So anyway, I appreciate the question. This is just one tiny example, but it is a systematic occurrence, a phenomenon that is happening to Palestinian livelihood, that even if it happens at the hand of a settler, which is likely to be the case in this situation, it is sanctioned by the Israeli state through the intentional blindness of the Israeli military in this case. Yeah, sorry.
You don't get more.
Get heated.
Yeah.
Oh, did you?
No, we'll answer that. But go ahead. We'll come back to Joe, Zach.
I've actually done some research on Israel between 48 and 53, and particularly how what was happening was explained to Americans who were supporting it at the time. And there were all these magazines that were printed in Israel in English for Americans to read who didn't read Hebrew.
Mm-hmm.
And if you looked on the maps, like Maryam said, you would see Israel marked off, and then the West Bank would be called Arab-held territory. But just think about what that means. That means it's provisional, it's not settled, someday it'll be ours. In one magazine, I found a list of the member countries of the United Nations, sorted according to continents. There are countries in Africa, countries in Asia, and so forth. And there was one category at the bottom that was called Other. And the only entry in that was Israel. Now think of what that means for a second. It means, in essence, that it refuses to be a part of the Levant, the Middle East. It's trying to maintain in some way that it's, I don't know what it is, a continent of its own, that has its own laws. So, in these early days, the Israelis, the existential anxiety of Israel was not just related to what happened in Europe, but to the knowledge at the bottom that everybody had that they were living in other people's houses. In fact, people had dreams where they would be a stranger in a house. It's obvious to think about what's going on there. Mm-hmm. And along the borders between Jordan and, which is the West Bank and Israel at the time, there were UN armistice commissions, which were composed of a certain number of Jordanians, a certain number of Israelis, and a certain number of UN observers. And what they would do is they would review all the border incidents at the time to see what happened. Now, what was the typical incident in 1949, 1951, 52? Some Palestinian farmer would wander back. He's got the key to his house. He's got the deed to it. He doesn't quite understand why he can't get back to his home. So this is a real problem for Israel. There's violence that happens when occasionally they run into people in the kibbutz, and then it's hashed out at the Armistice Commission. But Israel's response to this, where in fact it's the question that is raised by this kind of wandering back of people to their homes, where their stuff is in something called a custodian of absentee property in Israel, is people are starting to ask, wait a second, why aren't these people allowed back? Forget why they left. I mean, they have farms there and so forth. So it's a very dangerous moment for Israelis who, as Jose says at the time, had discovered the passion of archaeology, which was again an attempt to go beneath the surface to find out why the people who were farming the surface of it didn't really belong there, because there was some shard that would explain who really belonged there. Exactly. Israel was reaching around in every way to establish its legitimacy. So what happened essentially is they mounted a series of military raids led by Ariel Sharon. He had a guerrilla unit called Unit 101. So in these cases where people just wandering back, they would retaliate by going over into the West Bank, Jordan, killing 80 civilians in villages. There's a famous one called Kibbutz. I mean, you know all of this. So this is what's going on the ground in Israel. So what's going on in the U.S.? After every one of these incidents and wars, Israelis go to American businessmen like my father. They go up and down Park Avenue in New York with a large bowl to collect for Israel, and they've got pictures with them. The pictures are atrocity pictures, supposedly what the Arabs, they didn't even call people Palestinians, they were called Arabs. What the Arabs have done, and you have to think of these as the kind of things that appeared in American newspapers in the 19th century, where you'd see a wagon train with everybody scalped, and the idea was these people are savages, they simply don't learn to exist. The war is about scalping, it's about firing rockets from Gaza. It's not about dispossession of the land, as it was in America and it is then. Mm-hmm. So, a lot of these American Jewish businesses were secular. They had escaped from any contact or practicing Judaism. But Israel became a chance to kind of atone for that and find a connection to Judaism they didn't have. And they were all invited over to come to Israel and visit. Now, there are famous right-wing books about all the tourists to the Soviet Union in the 30s who were supposedly useful idiots because they went during the show trials of Stalin and they didn't see anything. But if you read the literature of Americans who go to Israel in the 50s, and if you're looking for kind of people who accept at face value, this is, almost infinitely worse. In every one, Israel is a land of the future with the sabras, a man and a woman staring in the distance, sort of looking like old Soviet posters of collective farms in the 30s and so forth. So you have this whole network that's going on where these people who are very well-to-do in America but are not asked to be part of government in America or can't get in a country club are invited by the mayor of Jerusalem, Teddy Kollek, and are shown, given the keys to the country. So that you built up this enormous resource of goodwill for Israel and in this particular area when those first 7 years, it was pretty vulnerable as to what would happen. So, I mean, it pains me to hear you keep talking out on a personal level to just, this conflict is so, you have to know so much to be able to unravel how everything that is more or less being said or believed in America is not true.
Yeah.
And I think, and last thing is, I'll say two moments that I think are crucial in America in the moment. In 1987, I think, or around then, the question was having a debate between Palestinians and Israelis on TV. It was the first time that any Palestinian voice had been heard. Hanan, Ashrawi, Saad, Erekat, and so forth were on. And for the first time, Americans could see that Palestinians actually had a position and were not these kind of savage monsters that the Israelis were portraying. Well, you can imagine the efforts that were met to try to prevent that thing from ever happening. And think about what's happening with the boycott now. They're actually trying to pass laws that make it criminal for Americans to do what they did in the case of South Africa and boycott an apartheid state. They're trying to find people and put them in jail to get university professors fired. Yeah. So this particular situation with Israel is absolutely, it's like a horror movie at every level.
It is.
And
it is. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Just really fast to respond. I really appreciate your comments. One, I would encourage anyone interested in this history to check out a film called Jaffa and Orange Clockwork, which presents amazing evidence of exactly what you're talking about. And the way that I hear what you're talking about is the selling of Israel like the selling of the frontier, the Western frontier in the U.S. Very parallel to that, appealing to certain sectors of society who have been disenfranchised in their own ways to come and participate on the front lines of settler colonialism very convincingly. So that is a great history to bring forth. And the other piece that I just wanted to say is that is continuing today. And so not only should we as people in the U.S. feel, responsible or connected to what Israel does because of the, $3 billion that we give to Israel, which is actually much more than that. In military aid, but also the fact that if you look at maps of settlements in, for example, Jerusalem and the West Bank, you can see gigantic blocks of settlements that are entirely American citizens. So we're not just talking about the U.S. government does, we're talking about actual U.S. citizens who are doing this stuff in a historic Palestine. That is something that should concern all of us. So thank you for that point.
Yeah, I just want to really quickly, I just want to just make a quick connection and then you can ask your question, but about in terms of what's happening in the U.S. in relationship to, Israel and Palestine and in relationship to Puerto Rico. So just to answer Charu's question very quickly, but it matters in the ways that we're talking about, kind of U.S. citizens' responsibility for this. And not only, and likewise in Puerto Rico, all the people that are going to live there and that have the money to pay the rent, and all that, they're all Americans, right? So there's a depopulation, but there's a lot of Americans that are going there and setting up shop. But the Jones Act specifically was a big, as I kind of already mentioned, was a really big hindrance to getting aid to Puerto Rico. We were at a fundraiser here in Seattle, and we had a chance to talk to Congresswoman and Pramila Jayapal, and she said that no, we're not going to suspend the Jones Act. We're not going to suspend the Jones Act because it's a labor issue, right? So what that means is that it's an issue that port workers that make up a large voting contingency, would not in support of suspending the Jones Act because they're the ones that are working on the ships, right? So politicians are not willing to sacrifice political capital, whether it's from this voting bloc, to suspend the Jones Act. So what this is like this clash between the kind of like the interests of the colonial subaltern and the working classes in the U.S. In this, there's countless examples of this, but the Jones Act is precisely that example. Yeah, there was.
Oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Oh, yeah. Go ahead. No.
I just wanted to make a quick connection to what you were saying before about how these issues in Israel and Palestine ultimately affect the United States as well and American citizens. Not that should be the standard that we
Sure, right.
rights matter
Right.
at all. But I'm sure you're familiar with the deadly exchange, the policing exchange, and border patrol, ICE, and Secret Service exchange that happens between the United States and Israel. A lot of the Zionist lobby actually funds for American police to go over to Israel and train with the IDF, with the Israeli Defense Forces, as well as border patrol at ICE as well. And it's interesting how we can see how similar violence and techniques end up reflecting in both places. Like on our southern border, for example, my family is from Gaza, and a bunch of my Gazan family texted me after that Guatemalan woman was killed on the border. And they were like, wow, it's like we can really see how these people are being trained by the same people. I mean, it's like the same stories, it's the same
playbook,
headlines, the same rhetoric, but it's just on different borders.
Are you involved with the deadly exchange?
Gdp.
Yeah, maybe you could tell the audience, because there's this really great organization locally, if you wouldn't mind.
So Jewish Voices for Peace, there's a branch in Seattle that works very closely, or has developed this campaign to end the deadly exchange, so ending the police exchange and with Israel. And I didn't know this before. I got involved with the campaign, but actually SPD, Seattle Police Department, a lot of the deputies and figureheads of SPD are actually trained in Israel. And so it's important that we get involved on that front too.
Yeah, so if you're interested, this is a local organization you can get involved with. They do demonstrations all the time. They have meetings. Look it up.
And you can put pressure on your Congress people to lift the Jones Act.
Yes.
I would add to that. I mean, I think there's another relationship there because, and I would say that's even a commonality because the issue of Palestine and the issue of Puerto Rico are both issues that both the Republican and Democratic parties are terrible at. And I was really taken aback when I had that conversation with Pramila Jayapal because I always thought that she was a very progressive person. And I specifically asked her, what are the Democrats going to do to set themselves apart from the horrors of what Trump has been doing with Puerto Rico, right? And she didn't have an answer for me. And then we got into this back and forth about the Jones Act, which she says, well, actually, no, this is protecting jobs. And if we got rid of the Jones Act, it would actually be bad for Puerto Ricans who are part of the shipping industry and all that, right? And I think sometimes it's a good reminder, right, that in some issues, both parties are virtually indistinguishable and equally complicit in these sorts of situations. And we have to peel off this surface understanding that we have that Seattle is a very progressive area. On these issues, people here are complicit, and they really have terrible politics when it comes to these things. And whatever people's individual politics are, they are not percolating down or up or whatever direction you want to think of in terms of their elected representatives in Congress. So that's definitely a pressure point that needs to be considered
I
here.
think
You
we
should
have to
talk
stop.
to Sean
but
Scott.
I think we have to stop.
Sean Scott is now he works for Camilla,
Okay.
and he's DSA.
Okay.
You should tell him all
Sure.
that.
I mean, I would love to be in communication with them.
I
Yeah.
just want to make a couple quick comments about the backlash. It was lifted for Texas.
It was temporary lifted, yes.
It was lifted for Florida. But they were talked about lifting it for Puerto Rico, but by the time ships would have gotten there, it would have been already
Right.
gone.
Right.
U.S. Virgin Islands, also colonial.
They have an exemption.
But they have an
Yeah.
exemption, and Puerto Rico doesn't.
They've had it for a long time too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Thank you.
It could be left.
Yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.